on your radio and online.
At home or on the road.
This is ABC Radio.
You're listening to Drive.
Good afternoon, Dom Knight with you for Drive on ABC Radio, Sydney, Canberra and around New South Wales. Thanks for joining me. Your regular presenters resume for 2023 on Monday. I'm with you. In the meantime, so conversations we didn't think we'd be having today when we woke up. The New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, has come out and apologised in a press conference for wearing a Nazi uniform at his own 21st, which had uniforms as its theme. A moment of youthful insensitivity, and he's called it naive. Or could it have broader implications for his re-election campaign? It's only a few months until the poll in March. Some commentators have already suggested in the media that it could place his very leadership in jeopardy. Also, speaking of that election campaign, we've been speaking about housing all week. It seems to be the most important issue in voters' minds as we prepare to go to the polls in New South Wales. I spoke to the Shadow Minister, Rose Jackson, earlier in the week about some of the opposition's plans. They've been making an announcement every day this week about what they want to do with their new agency, Homes New South Wales, including some ideas for social housing in Nowra that came out yesterday. We thought we'd look at what other things people are doing around the world. Are there some bigger ideas out there? And I mentioned to Rose Jackson the example of Singapore when we spoke. Amazingly, in Singapore, 80% of citizens are in government-built housing. 90% of them own those houses. Could there be lessons for Australia, perhaps, in Singapore as we start thinking about housing and the stress that many of us feel in trying to afford a place to live, let alone own that place to live? Another discussion this week, should pets be allowed on public transport? There's a campaign to permit this. The Animal Justice Party's involved. And there have been some other conversations around, such as should dogs be allowed on more beaches? And in the northern beaches of Sydney, there's talk of letting them run around for several hours of the day. And so we're going to have that conversation too. Where should pets be allowed? Should there be more off-leash opportunities for them? And should we have them on trains and buses more readily than we do now? We're not talking about assistance animals. We're talking specifically about pets. Those are some of the conversations we're going to have on Drive this afternoon. I hope you'll join us at any time. You can call in 1300 222 702. You can also text 0467 922 702 if you want to join the conversation. It's been a lovely day for many of us today. 25 and sunny in Sydney today, in Penrith 30 and mostly sunny. Canberra 32 and partly cloudy. Newcastle 24 and sunny. In Orange 30 and mostly cloudy. Byron 25 partly cloudy. Wollongong 24 and mostly sunny. Tweed Heads 26 and mostly cloudy. Wagga 37 and mostly cloudy. Moree 35 and partly cloudy. And in Nowra 26 degrees and mostly sunny. So a little bit of cloud around, but fairly pleasant, certainly compared to that miserable period last week, at least in Sydney.
You're listening to Drive on ABC Radio.
Dom Knight with you. Great fun to get to speak to everyone in New South Wales and the ACT throughout this week. Have you ever tried to give up smoking? It can be very, very difficult. I've never smoked myself, thank goodness, but I've seen a lot of people really having a hard time giving up the ciggies. The allure of that nicotine hit, the addiction, can override the health benefits that it's very clear on the packet these days. You'll know that you have if you don't light up the cigarette. Then vaping's come into the market, and that seems to be a real game changer. You can really vape anywhere, even in bed if you're so inclined, I'm told. It's an easier way to do it and has less social stigma, apparently, because you're not putting all that passive smoke out the way you are with a cigarette. Getting your nicotine fix has just gotten easier and easier with vaping. So if you're addicted to vaping rather than ciggies, how do you finally give that up? Well, Alex Gorman is lifestyle editor of The Guardian, and she's written about this week, her journey with vaping. It was a fascinating story. We want to hear more. Alex Gorman, welcome to Drive.
Thank you, Dom. Thanks for having me.
Now, I've never tried a vape, I have to confess. What are they? How do they actually work? I've seen people using them. Friends of mine are into them. What's the sensation?
Well, there's a million different permutations of vapes, and they all work slightly differently, and some of them don't work at all, as I'm sure people who vape have found. But ultimately, the sensation is pleasurable. It's kind of people smoke for a reason. They smoke because it might make them feel more relaxed, it might make them focus, it feels good. Like there's not no reason why people smoke. And vaping basically delivers the same hit as smoking a cigarette, but it doesn't come with smoke, it doesn't come with the unpleasant smell, and there are some vapes that are even flavored like sweet candies, which weren't my drug of choice, but are certainly a real problem with teenagers now.
Mm.
And at least if you're me, I would from time to time smoke socially just because my friends were doing it and it's kind of a nice way to bond. And then suddenly in 2018, I was living in New York and everyone switched from smoking cigarettes socially to vaping socially. So I jumped off a bridge just like my mates did, as the old saying goes, and bought a Juul device and started vaping. And I just really quickly found myself doing it all the time because if something feels really good and doesn't feel bad at all, you do it more and more. And it turns out what I was playing with without really being cognizant of what was happening is one of the most addictive substances in the world. So if you're already super hooked on smoking cigarettes and you switch to vaping, that's like a very different kettle of fish from my
Right.
situation and my personal experience.
And you've described
But
yourself, Alex, as a nicotine fiend once you got
yes,
onto these things. How did that manifest
yeah.
itself?
Well, basically, it manifested itself when I went without. So I found myself vaping more and more and more, and particularly when lockdowns hit and we all started working from home. My real tipping point was when I started vaping at my desk
Oh, right.
all the time. Um, and then if I went even a short period of time without vaping, like an hour, I would start to feel really grumpy, really twitchy, really on edge. If I stretched that time out longer, by the third hour, it was physically painful. Like
Oh,
I
gosh.
felt agonized. And if it kept going, my mood would just crash through the floor. I wouldn't be able to think about anything except how much I wanted to vape. It was truly a horrible experience. And it was that quite visceral experience of addiction that I'd sort of gotten myself caught up in without really being mindful or cognizant that made me realize that I needed to quit because you shouldn't need anything and want anything as much as I needed and wanted to vape.
And yes, I mean, a couple of hours without and suddenly you're craving it. That does sound quite troubling. The Lung
Yeah,
Foundation.
and not just craving it, like truly it felt like the world would end if I didn't vape.
Yeah, right. I want to be clear. The Lung Foundation says, and I know you agree, Alex, that vaping is unsafe and potentially dangerous. The long-term health effects are unclear, but they know that vaping in the short term has been associated with nausea, vomiting, mouth and airway irritation, chest pain and heart palpitations. And they list some of the toxic particles in vapes. But you found yourself at one point, Alex, and I really admire you coming forward and writing about this. You discovered a vape in the back of, was it a ride share, and you pocketed it.
Yeah, so this was actually after I'd already successfully quit vaping for more than a month.
Oh, no.
And I was just like, I'd been through the absolute agony of withdrawals, gotten over the hard part. And I was just in a particularly kind of cheery, relaxed mood, not really thinking about my actions. And just a vape came up to me and I said, yes, please, because I really hadn't done any of the sort of emotional work around training myself to not do it. At the time, I wasn't on nicotine replacement therapy, which is something that I've personally found has really helped manage my cravings, although, of course, everyone is different and your mileage may vary. I hadn't done any of that work yet. And so I just kind of helplessly and without really thinking about it, relapsed.
And you've mentioned this is particularly a problem for young people. Your article says, Alex Gorman, in Australia, I'm quoting here, children are using disposable vapes bought under the counter at convenience stores. And you checked how strong they are and you describe them as hitting like prize fighters. So a lot of young people and indeed children are using these potentially dangerous products. And it sounds as though the nicotine hit is immense.
Yeah, when I talked to the CEO of Cancer Victoria, he told me basically that we don't really know when it's an illegal vape, because these are all illegal vapes, how strong they are, how much nicotine there is in them. But my experience of vaping using a product called Juul that has nicotine percentages and was in the US, where it was a bit not regulated, I want to say, but I think the percentages are more likely to be accurate than on these completely sketchy Australian products. I know what it feels like to inhale a vape that's 5% nicotine.
Right.
And
ours are much stronger.
I also know what it feels like to smoke one of ours, and they're much stronger.
So it sounds as like there's kind of loophole central. Despite Australia being a world leader in kind of tobacco regulation and public health programs to combat it, things like the plain packaging rules and all the health warnings, it seems that vapes are somehow escaping the tough regime that we've had before, and they're also dramatically cheaper, you say, than regular cigarettes.
Yeah, they're hugely cheaper. So when I was buying Juul pods from overseas and getting them sent to Australia, which was very quick and easy to do, it was costing me less than a seventh of what it would have cost to smoke cigarettes. And you can buy a disposable vape that, you don't really know how long it'll last and you don't really know how strong it is, but it's definitely strong for around $11 to $20, whereas a packet of cigarettes these days could set you back between $35 and $40. So the price difference is pretty big, and
And clearly, young people,
strong.
Limited budgets are going to go with the vapes. If you've had struggles with vaping, like Alex Gorman, who's written this very revealing article about it, which certainly taught me a lot, 0467 922 702, send me a text or call 1300 222 702. And Alex, you've said it's been really hard to give up. I know you haven't been a regular smoker, so you probably can't compare, but it sounds genuinely quite tough to give them away.
Yeah, exactly. I think because I haven't been a regular smoker, I just wasn't particularly careful about how I was vaping. And that's how I ended up kind of just doing it more and more in the first place, because I wasn't cognizant of how addictive nicotine can be. But when I tried to give them up, what I found at the time, and that is changing, fortunately, but what I found was that all of the cessation programs that were available and all of the information we had was really targeted at smokers who are smoking cigarettes. And a lot of it even kind of recommended vaping as an alternative. So when you're super hooked on nicotine and everything about how to quit is telling you how to quit smoking, and what you're doing is not smoking, it can be quite challenging to figure out the path forward. My GP was baffled. It was a very difficult process, not only because quitting nicotine is always a really difficult process, but because of the specifics of trying to quit a pretty novel substance where we don't actually necessarily know how to support people going through withdrawals, and where at least my nicotine consumption was much, much higher than a typical smoker's in the last 10, 15 years or so would have been. There aren't that many pack-a-day smokers left.
Yeah, and it seems as though the kind of marketers have hit on a fairly nightmarish replacement where we don't know how strong they are. They're not regulated as much as cigarettes are. There's not the public health campaigns.
Well, it's not so much that they're not regulated as that there's just a huge black market.
It's a black market. But even so,
Yeah, it's a
that's
black
kind of another
market.
problem as well. It's a
Yeah.
problem of regulation. So, and then there's not guidance to quit that's as clear as there was for cigarettes. So clearly some work needs to be done, I suspect, from a public health perspective. And your article's pretty compelling on that front. Thank you for sharing your story. I think we've got texts and calls coming in for other people who are in the same situation. Your recommendation was nicotine replacement therapy. I really hope it comes good for you, Alex, in the long term. And thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks so much, Dom.
That's Alex Gorman there, lifestyle editor at The Guardian. If you want to read her tale of woe and at the point where she grabbed someone else's vape in the back of a rideshare, it's at The Guardian website.
You're listening to Drive
on ABC Radio.
Dom Knight with you across New South Wales and Canberra on ABC Radio and as well as ABC Radio Sydney. And it's a conversation I wasn't expecting to have today, but the Premier's come out and confessed to wearing a Nazi costume to his own 21st birthday party. He told a press conference at Sydney today that he decided to come forward after receiving a phone call from a cabinet colleague 2 days ago. Now, quite a few of us will probably think of Prince Harry, who's been talking about his own bad decision in the past week or so in his autobiography. But it's interesting also to think of the wider implications of a colleague telling him about this and fronting the media along with his deputy, Matt Keane, today. To tell us more, Tim Swanston is here, one of our reporters. Hi, Tim.
Good afternoon.
So what's the latest on this? What's the Premier's, pitch in telling people this today?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you mentioned, I'm sure not many people had it on kind of their scorecard for what was coming out in the news today. But Dominic Perrottet called a press conference with respect to, he said it was going to be about the economy. And then when reporters gathered there, he sort of made a bit of a statement about that, but then very quickly moved on to what was quite clearly quite a somber matter for him in, revealing that he had worn a Nazi uniform for his 21st birthday party. He said it was a uniform-themed party. And yes, he received a call from a cabinet colleague 2 days ago, where they were talking about a range of things, but apparently this came up. And so his essential pitch that he's saying to people is like, look, I've thought about talking about this, many times. Perhaps I should have spoken about this earlier. But he's effectively gravely sorry for the mistake that he made. So he did say that he's deeply ashamed of what he's done. He's truly sorry for the hurt and the pain that will cause for people right across our state. So it's something that, certainly made for quite an uncomfortable press conference this afternoon, where he was asked all sorts of, questions, and many people, of course, put to him is whether or not, there is a political element in this. Of course, the state election is not too far away in March, and whether or not this is a bad look, sort of revealing that this has come up. It was, of course, put to him whether or not, effectively whether or not people had something, over him, or if this would have come out, or if there was a photograph. And he said, look, he's not aware of any of that. For him, this felt like basically a personal decision on reflection after that conversation he had with a colleague.
Well, he said as well, I understand, that his parents told him the next day that it was wrong and insensitive. So the feedback came fairly quickly. But I guess, Tim, the broader implications of who told him that this was happening was the gossip doing the rounds. And has anyone got an agenda here? It's probably too early to say. But yet we know that, no political leader in Australia is necessarily safe from challenges. There's always someone with a knife somewhere, or perhaps even an anecdote about a party nearly 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And of course, that kind of speculation is very likely to be rife today. Certainly a lot of those questions were put to the Premier, exactly as I said, about whether or not, this colleague had an axe to grind, or whether or not, this is doing the rounds, if there's a photo. And really the pitch that the Premier put on this was like, look, no, this is something that upon reflection that he's really decided that he wanted to front up, and he wanted the people of New South Wales to hear from him. He was certainly at great lengths to say that, look, this is for me to fess up and for me to talk about my poor decision. And of course, in doing so, he did deeply apologise to members of the Jewish community, to Holocaust survivors, veterans and their families. And we're expecting him to meet with representatives of the Jewish Board of Directors this afternoon, of course, to have some of those discussions. But he's already made quite a few phone calls, it appears, this morning, talking to senior members of the Jewish community.
Certainly an inconvenient thing to come out 2 months before an election campaign when you're a premier, trying to present yourself as a kind of a young, dynamic force that kind of gets it. That's been his pitch since he started, and that will be, I suppose, somewhat undermined by this news. Have the opposition commented at this point?
We haven't heard anything from the opposition as of yet. They're probably sitting there waiting to think about how they're going to respond to this particular piece of information. We are starting to get some reaction, of course, pouring in, first and foremost from the Jewish community. So Darren Bark, from the CEO of the Jewish Board of Deputies, did say that he appreciates that the Premier reached out to him and reached out to the community this afternoon to express that deep and sincere regret about his poor choice of costume as a young man. But in speaking about their meeting, which is expected to happen quite shortly, he said that there is a lot of distress and hurt from the community today. Today is not a good day for the Jewish community and not a good day for the Premier. And of course, this will have implications, likely for him politically, but at least as far as the reaction goes, we are, seeing that senior figures of the Jewish community are accepting his apology that he's made today. Another statement here, this is from federal MP Julian Leeser, who was the first Jewish person elected to the House of Representatives from New South Wales for the Liberal Party, and he says that Dominic Perrottet has been a friend of his for many years. Their electorates are actually quite, do overlap, but he says he counts Dom as a friend who has proven himself to be much better than his worst moment. So as far as if people have the damage calculators out at the moment, seeing what this could do outside of the election, it remains to be seen as to what this will likely do for his image.
Well, it's interesting. I've seen one commentator rushing into print and saying that this might put his leadership in jeopardy. It might put his election campaign in jeopardy. This will be for voters to decide in the long term. Keen to get the views of listeners to Drive, 0467 922 702. If you want to text a point of view on this, I guess it might be helpful just in getting a sense of how New South Wales feels about their Premier revealing this today. If people text in and give us a view on this, and I'm starting to get some texts in already, which I'll read out shortly. So I guess we wait and see, Tim Swanston, but doubtless this is not the conversation that the Premier wanted to be having today as he tries to unfold a campaign strategy. I guess looking at New South Wales politics more broadly, we've seen a very active week for the opposition. There's been a lot of discussion about housing. They've had an announcement every single day. And the government's been relatively quiet by contrast. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And, this is a damaging point, of course, if at this particular point in time, the opposition are really trying to capitalise on a particular, amount of momentum. They, of course, had their response to the land tax, of course, one of Dominic Perrottet's real, cut and thrusts in this election, and of course, exactly, they've been making announcements with respect to rent, especially in regional areas, and they're, doing a fair bit of space with respect to rents as well today. So certainly probably not the conversation that the government wanted to be having today, but one, that Dominic Perrottet did sort of feel that it was clearly time to do after this discussion.
Yes, and the ABC News story that we published a short while ago, which I think is one of the top read stories on the website, points out that in October he called for a lifetime ban for fans who made Nazi salutes at the Australia Cup final in Western Sydney. And so he's clearly aware of these issues now, and far more than he was at the age of 21.
And of course, that's something that's been pointed out to him repeatedly, and the Jewish community itself, of course, say that he has been a proud supporter, and he's throughout his time in public life, he ensured the Sydney Jewish Museum received funding, so that it could continue to educate the community about the Holocaust. Like, it's, of course, it was put to him at pains that he's clearly gone to lengths to be a staunch advocate for the Jewish community, yet has sort of been, in effect, holding on to this probably terrible secret. And even just looking at his body language as well in the press conference, he looked very at pains, about this particular issue. And again, he did say that perhaps he should have spoken about this sooner, but it's clearly been a point of reflection for him quite many times.
I suppose interesting to note the difference between a lifetime ban for a bad moment at a football game with, I guess, coming forward and talking about youthful naivety. Anyway, it's a developing story. No doubt there'll be more on this as the afternoon progresses. Really appreciate you updating us, Tim.
You're welcome.
That's Tim Swanston, ABC reporter on Drive. Dom Knight with you, and lots of texts in here. Is the Premier going to say sorry to the gay community as well? Nazis did not only kill Jewish people, says someone on the text line. Ian says, regardless of whether there was an agenda, we still knew Hitler and the Nazis were bad and evil 20 years ago. But move on, please. It won't change my vote, as I'll be voting on other issues such as environmental, economic, pokies and other such issues. That's Ian in the Blue Mountains. Denise says the Premier obviously got a heads up. Some photos are about to be released. Why didn't he say anything previously? Is a question there. So we'll continue to pass on your thoughts on this. Mac points out the distinction between Dominic Perrottet taking responsibility and Prince Harry pointing to his brother and sister-in-law. If you've got any more thoughts, 0467 922 702. As always, we try and present a range of your views as we discuss these political issues here on ABC Radio. Let's find out what's happening on the road. Good afternoon, Warren Purchase.
G'day, Dom. Kermond in the lower Blue Mountains on Bell's Line of Road. At Bell's Lane, we have a nasty crash. All directions affected. Avoid